Despite some of the familiar pageantry today I've been talking about, it's worth repeating that what we saw today was not a normal inauguration of an American president. I mean, standing in the building where just 4 years prior his live-fueled attempt to steal the 2020 resulted in bloodshed, Donald Trump took the oath of office as the 47th president of the United States. And among those placed in seats of honor on the dais surrounding Trump were not just former presidents, some were there, or members of Congress, or his family, or his cabinet nominees, but there was also a small handful of wealthy tech billionaires. And to be clear, that seating arrangement doesn't happen by accident. It's really hard to imagine a scenario where the Trump inaugural team didn't get to decide who, outside of some members of Congress, was invited to attend the smaller speech indoors. And they definitely decided who sat on the dais behind them. Plenty of seats for tech billionaires, no seats for tens of thousands of other ticket holders who were left watching on a jumbotron. And that choice kind of speaks volumes. Now, you might remember many of those same tech billionaires actually condemned Trump and his lies just 4 years ago. So they've clearly been making their own new calculations. We've seen them all parading down to Mar-a-Lago to get FaceTime with Trump. They poured millions of dollars into his inaugural fund. Some have cut deals with his family members, and some have changed their platforms to make them more friendly to Trump, his allies, and the conspiracies and talking points they pump out to flood our information systems. Taken all together, this feels like a pretty overt transaction, best illustrated by Trump's relationship with the richest man in the world, Elon Musk. During the campaign, remember, Musk donated $250 million to Trump's reelection effort. That was a little bit of a slip there, Freudian slip, and used the reach of his social media platform to amplify Trump's message. Now, Musk, who runs multiple companies with federal contracts and has long complained about federal regulations, will lead an agency board that will give recommendations on government spending and regulations from an office on the White House complex. This is not normal. Trump is giving influence and policy preference to basically whatever billionaire is willing to pay. He's prioritizing the wealthy and obsequious few. And in a brief moment during his inaugural address, Trump made that priority fairly clear.
Los Angeles, where we're watching fires still tragically burn from weeks ago without even a token of defense. They're raging through the houses and communities, even affecting some of the wealthiest and most powerful individuals in our country, some of whom are sitting here right now. They don't have a home any longer. That's interesting.
To be clear, more than 100,000 people have lost their homes from those wildfires. And yet it's the, quote, wealthiest and the most powerful that Trump chose to mention. Look, the rich and powerful have always had an outsized influence in our society, but what we are seeing coalesce openly around Trump now appears to be something different. And Democratic Senator Chris Murphy has a clear definition of what we are witnessing. In a new piece out today, he writes, "What you are watching is the construction of an oligarchy where a handful of crazy, rich, self-interested billionaires work with an elected leader to grab power so that the government works to enrich the small cabal of wealthy insiders and no one else." It's quite chilling. Joining me now is Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut. That's a pretty chilling statement, and it's important for people to hear. I agree with you. But for folks kind of just tuning into this threat, tell us more about what concerns you the most.
Yeah, I mean, oligarchy is a big word. It's an old word, but it exists because it describes lots of civilizations. There are lots of nations over the years that have been run by a strong leader in league with the richest men of that country. And they do favors for each other. The oligarchs, the rich men, protect the leader. The leader, in turn, enriches, to a greater extent, the rich men. And it's not a coincidence that the rich men that you saw up there on that stage today, the billionaires, people making ungodly amounts of money, are also running the nation's information infrastructure, because those men can do a specific favor for Donald Trump. They can tilt the balance of information in this country towards Donald Trump and away from his opposition. What can Donald Trump do for them? Every single one of those guys on stage today have interest before the government. Tim Cook doesn't want Apple's iPhones to be subject to Trump's tariffs. Meta, Facebook, has a pending case that the FTC has brought against it that Trump could dismiss. Of course, Elon Musk is a billionaire because of federal contracts that he gets. So it's a pretty old-fashioned, time-tested, fundamental corruption. The richest people in the country get into business with the leader. They scratch each other's back, and poof, before you know it, democracy is gone. And this is the last thing to say. Oligarchy stands in contrast to democracy, because once the richest people start doing deals with the leader, then they can rig the rules of governance so that there's really no choice left in elections. And that's how it becomes permanent.
Oligarchy is also just basically a bunch of really rich guys who have way too much influence. And that's what we're seeing literally on the dais today at the inauguration. You also said something, I mean, this is, I think, hopefully one of the wake-up calls for anybody who is concerned about the threats to our democracy, that the left needs to do more to build their own information environment. There's no question about that. But what does that exactly look like to you? Is there anything you're seeing out there right now that feels promising?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, we need to understand that when the right starts saying something, like when they started claiming that Haitians were eating cats and dogs in Ohio, within hours, maybe within days, it becomes amplified very quickly amongst the online right. That's because the right has consciously built an infrastructure all around this country, content makers and producers, people who disseminate ideas. Some of it's organic, but a lot of it is intentional and paid for. The left has to do the same thing. We've got some really great innovators right now who are creating content, who are helping progressives amplify pro-democracy messages. And instead of just sort of feeding money to the ad makers who essentially rent space every 4 years, giving money often to Facebook and Sinclair Media, opponents of the left, we should be building that kind of permanent infrastructure. So I hope that that's the mission that the Democratic Party undertakes in the next few years. We don't have to copy what they do, but we can't be operating in an information vacuum.
It's also probably going to require other senators and elected officials, prominent ones like yourself, recognizing the value of that and not relying only on more old school means of communicating. There's so much that happened today, to state the obvious. I've been talking about it all show. I talked to your colleague, Senator Schiff, about it. But I do want to ask you a couple of things we just saw in the Oval Office, including pardons for 1,500 January 6th insurrectionists. Trump even commuted the sentence of Stuart Rhodes, the leader of the Oath Keepers, who was convicted of seditious conspiracy. What was your reaction as you watched that happen in the Oval Office?
I mean, this is the most unconscionable act of the day. It could go down as the most unconscionable act of this year. Listen, we are a democracy. We are a peaceful democracy. The bedrock that has kept us standing for 240 years is that we don't endorse violence as a means to grab power. That's what those protesters, that's what those rioters were doing. They were storming the Capitol, beating police officers over the head with flagpoles in order to seize power for their leader. And by endorsing and celebrating their actions today, by making sure that they won't be accountable for what they did, it guarantees that it will happen again. And by the way, it might not be at a national level. Trump has now basically said, if you carry out acts of violence to try to put your favorite leader in power, there's a good chance you will never, ever be held accountable for it. Remember, Gretchen Whitmer almost lost her life in Michigan because another group of vigilantes had a plan to kidnap her and kill her. Right? So this puts elected leaders all across the country, maybe today on the left, but down the line on the right and left, in jeopardy because political violence just got mainstreamed. It's a cowardly and unconscionable thing that Donald Trump has done.
Zero consequences for these people, which is really remarkable, unbelievable, horrifying. He signed a number of executive orders today, and there's so much for us to dive into. I feel like we're all trying to digest it. One of them was an executive order giving TikTok a 75-day extension. I know you've said you'd rather see Congress tackle legislation that protects children online rather than focus on banning one social media platform. Totally fair. But where does this go from here, do you think?
Well, I don't know that TikTok is really interested in selling, but what has been clear over the last 48 hours is they're really interested in getting in good with Donald Trump. And that may be because TikTok is ultimately answerable to the Chinese government. And so they're trying to cut a favorable deal with Trump so that he'll give China a pass on the issue of trade or give them a pass on Taiwan. What Trump said the other day is that he wants the federal government to take a 50% stake in TikTok. That means Donald Trump gets to run TikTok. Well, Donald Trump Jr. gets to run Twitter. Once again, you're seeing the Trump administration try assiduously to take control of the country's information infrastructure, to have state-run, state-controlled media. That's another way that democracy goes down the drain.
You know where there's state-run controlled media? You know well, Senator. China, Russia, a lot of those countries out there we certainly don't want to model. Thank you so much for joining me, Senator Murphy. Always love talking to you.